The friendship between David McCallum and Charles Bronson cost him everything. David McCallum is born on September 19, 1933 in Glasgow, Scotland, into a world already vibrating with music, art, and ambition. His father, a world-renowned violinist, his mother, a gifted cellist. Every note that filled their home seemed to whisper one thing to young David: you were born to perform. But no one, not even him, could have guessed just how far that calling would take him, or what it would eventually cost. From the quiet streets of post-war Glasgow to the glamorous chaos of Hollywood, McCallum's rise felt unstoppable. He studied at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art, trained beside Britain's best, and stepped into film at a time when the movie industry was rewriting itself. In The Great Escape, 1963, the world saw a new kind of star. Intense, intelligent, mysterious. That's where he met another rising legend, Charles Bronson. Bronson, the brooding American with a stare like cold steel and a reputation for keeping his emotions locked away. On screen, they were brothers in arms. Off screen, friends. Real friends. The kind you trust without question. But sometimes, the people we trust most are the ones destiny uses to break us. And for David McCallum, that moment of betrayal was already on its way. At first, it seemed innocent enough. Two actors bonding over long shooting days, late-night drinks, and quiet conversations about the business. Charles Bronson and David McCallum, two completely different men, yet somehow cut from the same cloth. McCallum was the intellectual, the gentleman, the artist who carried himself with quiet confidence. Bronson was the tough guy, rough edges and raw intensity, a man who didn't say much, but when he did, people listened. On set, they joked between takes. Bronson respected McCallum's craft. McCallum admired Bronson's grit. They weren't just co-stars, they became brothers in an industry where real friendships are rare. And because of that trust, McCallum invited Bronson into his world, his home, his family, his wife, Jill Ireland. Jill was radiant, warm, and alive with ambition. She and David had married young, back when dreams still felt unbreakable. Together they had built something real. 3 children, a shared purpose, and a future most couples could only envy. But Hollywood has a way of testing what's real. When Jill met Bronson, sparks began to flicker in the dark. Slow, subtle, almost invisible at first. Bronson's quiet charm, his confidence, the danger in his stillness, it was magnetic. And though no one said it out loud, everyone around them could feel something shifting. There's a rumor, one that's echoed through decades of interviews in Hollywood whispers, that Bronson once told McCallum straight to his face, "I'm going to marry your wife." Imagine hearing that from the man you call your best friend. David always denied remembering that line. Maybe it never happened. Maybe he just couldn't let himself believe it did. But the truth was already unfolding. While David was spending long days filming The Man from UNCLE, Jill and Bronson were spending time together. On set, off set, quietly building a connection that would soon explode into something undeniable. By 1966, David's marriage was cracking under the pressure of fame, distance, and secrets nobody dared to name. By 1967, it was over. And months later, Jill Ireland was no longer Mrs. McCallum. She was Mrs. Bronson. The fallout was brutal, not just because of what happened, but who it happened with. McCallum lost his wife, he lost his friend, and in many ways, he lost the simple belief that loyalty still existed in Hollywood. But what happened next, how McCallum handled it, would define him forever. Because instead of revenge, he chose something that would shock everyone who knew him. Fame looks beautiful from the outside, but behind the lights, it eats everything it touches. And David McCallum's perfect world was about to collapse in slow motion. By the mid-1960s, David was everywhere. His face was on billboards, magazines, even lunchboxes. The Man from UNCLE had made him an international sensation. The mysterious Russian agent everyone wanted to know more about. But while the world cheered him on, his home life was quietly burning down. Jill Ireland, once his partner in every sense, was now more of a memory than a companion. She was acting in her own films, moving through circles filled with new faces, new energy, and one of those faces was Charles Bronson. David was constantly on set, often thousands of miles away. Jill, meanwhile, was spending more time with the man David had once trusted more than anyone. Friends began to notice small things: a shift in tone, a glance that lingered too long, moments between Jill and Bronson that felt heavier than they should. Hollywood is full of whispers, but this one wasn't just rumor. It was real. David felt it before he ever saw it. He described that time as an extremely difficult period, not least because we had 3 children. Imagine working 16-hour days, flying between continents, and coming home to silence that feels louder than applause. By 1966, the marriage was hanging by a thread. They tried to fix it: dinners, trips, polite conversations that didn't mean anything anymore. But when love fades, the sound of it dying is unmistakable. Then came the moment every betrayed heart knows. When you realize it's already over, you just haven't said it yet. In February 1967, the divorce was finalized. A 10-year marriage, gone. And within months, Jill Ireland appeared publicly with Charles Bronson. To the outside world, it looked like Hollywood romance. To David, it was something darker, a friendship that turned into the ultimate betrayal. But instead of exploding, he went quiet. No press statements, no blame. Just a man standing in the wreckage of his old life, holding on to what little peace he could find. And yet, even then, he didn't hate them. Not Jill, not Bronson. He just kept moving forward. Because sometimes survival means walking through the fire without looking back. But the story wasn't over, not even close. Because what came next, Jill's life with Bronson, would be just as dramatic, and in some ways, just as tragic. When Jill Ireland and Charles Bronson married in 1968, it was the kind of Hollywood headline that sold papers for weeks. The rugged American tough guy, the elegant British beauty. Together they looked unstoppable, the perfect match born out of chaos. And for a while, it worked. They moved into a luxurious Los Angeles home with sprawling gardens and movie posters framed like trophies. They raised children, hosted parties, and worked together on more than 15 films, a husband and wife power duo before that was even a thing. But behind the camera, it wasn't all glamour. Bronson was intense, famously private, sometimes controlling, always larger than life. Jill, on the other hand, was fiercely independent. 2 strong personalities locked in a partnership that burned hot and fast. Their chemistry was real, on screen and off, but so were the storms. Friends said Bronson could be moody, withdrawn, a man haunted by his past. And Jill, she had lived through heartbreak once. She knew what loss felt like, and she wasn't about to let it happen again. So she stood by him, through fame, fortune, and film after film. While others faded, the Bronsons stayed relevant, partly because of their bond, partly because Hollywood loved a story that began in scandal. But scandal fades. Reality doesn't. Behind the red carpets, they dealt with normal problems: kids, money, exhaustion, and the kind of emotional distance that fame always brings back. And yet somehow they stayed together, for more than 2 decades, until life threw something at them that no spotlight could outshine. In 1984, Jill Ireland was diagnosed with breast cancer. It hit like a thunderclap. She had built her entire life around beauty, strength, and control. And suddenly, all 3 were slipping away. But Jill wasn't the kind of woman who hid. She faced it head on. She wrote books. She went on talk shows. She became a voice for millions of women fighting the same battle. And Bronson, the same man who once broke another man's heart, stayed by her side through every moment, every treatment, every hospital visit, every sleepless night. It was a different kind of love now, quieter, deeper, built not on attraction, but survival. For 6 years they fought together, and in 1990 the fight ended. Jill Ireland passed away at just 54 years old. When Charles Bronson walked out of that hospital for the last time, friends said he looked like a man who had lost his soul. For all the pain his love once caused, he had paid the ultimate price for it. And somewhere out there, David McCallum, the man whose heart had been broken decades earlier, heard the news. He didn't celebrate. He didn't speak. He just said softly, "Life goes on. It always does." You'd think after losing your wife to your best friend, you'd want revenge, anger, bitterness, something. But David McCallum wasn't built like that. He didn't explode, he evolved. When the divorce papers were signed, most people expected him to spiral. He was at the top of his career, but fame means nothing when you're eating alone. And yet, instead of hiding, he went back to work. He threw himself into acting. The Great Escape, The Man from UNCLE, and dozens of other roles that demanded every ounce of discipline he had left. Because sometimes, work is the only thing keeping you from falling apart. But the real story isn't about his career. It's about his heart. Here's what shocked everyone. David never spoke badly about Jill. Never insulted Bronson. Never tried to rewrite what happened. When asked years later about the affair, he simply said, "I never hated him. I never hated her. It was just life, just life." 3 words that carried more strength than any revenge ever could. While Hollywood thrives on drama, McCallum chose silence, not because he didn't feel pain, but because he refused to live in it. He found peace in the one thing nobody could take away, his ability to move forward. In the 1970s, he quietly remarried to Catherine Carpenter, a model and actress, and that marriage lasted over 50 years. 5 decades of loyalty, respect, and calm, the complete opposite of the chaos he once lived through. It's almost poetic. The man who lost everything because of love ended up proving that real love never demands attention. It just endures. While the tabloids chased scandal, McCallum built a legacy. Not the loud, flashy kind, but the kind that leaves a mark because of its quiet dignity. He became known as the gentleman of Hollywood, a man who'd been through fire and still managed to walk out clean. And in a world addicted to revenge, that made him something rare. Something unforgettable. But fate wasn't done writing his story, because decades later, when both men were old, the past would find a strange and unexpected peace. Years passed, the scandals faded, the headlines yellowed, and Hollywood moved on. As it always does. Charles Bronson went on to become an icon of tough guy cinema. Death Wish, The Mechanic, Once Upon a Time in the West. A man who played justice on screen, even as his own life carried the weight of his past choices. David McCallum kept working steadily, though more quietly. He didn't chase fame anymore. He built something deeper. He became a respected character actor, appearing in shows like Colditz and Sapphire and Steel. And then, decades later, in his 70s, when most actors had long retired, he found a second wave of fame with NCIS. Millions of new viewers met him as Dr. Donald "Ducky" Mallard, the wise, kind, almost fatherly medical examiner who always saw the humanity in every case. That wasn't just acting. That was David McCallum being David McCallum. Because after everything he'd lived through, betrayal, heartbreak, loss, he had become a man who understood people, pain, and forgiveness better than most. Meanwhile, Charles Bronson's life began to slow down. After Jill's death in 1990, he became more reclusive, quieter, reflective, almost haunted. He rarely spoke about Jill publicly, but those who knew him said he never truly got over her. And somewhere in that silence, maybe there was a kind of peace, because sometimes the greatest punishment isn't losing love, it's realizing how much it once meant. By the early 2000s, both men were old, their rivalry long buried under the dust of time. When Bronson passed away in 2003, David was asked about him once more. He didn't speak with bitterness. He didn't gloat. He simply said, "I wish him peace." 3 simple words, but they carried the weight of an entire lifetime. That's the thing about true class. It doesn't shout, it whispers. And when David McCallum himself passed away in 2023 at the age of 90, the tributes poured in from every corner of Hollywood. Not for scandal, not for gossip, but for a man who proved that grace is stronger than revenge, and that forgiveness, quiet as it is, can echo louder than any tabloid headline. Because in the end, the story of David McCallum and Charles Bronson wasn't just about betrayal. It was about what we choose to do after betrayal. And McCallum chose peace. That's why his legacy didn't just survive, it transcended. By the time David McCallum reached his 80s, most people his age were long gone from the spotlight. But not him. Every week on NCIS, millions of fans tuned in to see that calm, brilliant man with the soft Scottish voice. The one who could explain death, yet make it sound almost poetic. He wasn't just playing Ducky, he was Ducky. That gentle smile, the patient tone, the little spark of humor when things got dark. That was David, the man who had already lived through heartbreak, betrayal, and redemption, and had come out the other side still believing in kindness. You could see it in his eyes. He wasn't acting anymore. He was teaching. Every time Ducky spoke about loss, it wasn't scripted. It was truth. Lines like, "The dead can't speak, but they still have stories to tell," hit differently when you knew his story. Fans who had no idea about his past could still feel it. The depth, the pain, the wisdom that only comes from living through the unthinkable. And maybe that's why he became a fan favorite again, even in a new century. In an era obsessed with youth and fame, David McCallum reminded the world that grace never goes out of style. He didn't chase trends. He didn't fake controversy. He just kept showing up, prepared, humble, and better than ever. When asked in an interview how he managed to stay grounded after everything, he smiled and said, "You can't hold on to pain. You can only carry it until you learn to set it down." That's not just advice, that's philosophy. The kind that makes you stop scrolling for a second and think. And when people talk about the great escape today, they don't just remember Steve McQueen or Charles Bronson. They remember the quiet man who outlived the drama, outlasted the heartbreak, and turned it all into wisdom. He became living proof that your past doesn't define you. Your reaction to it does. But the story didn't end there. Because even in death, David McCallum found a way to leave one last unforgettable message behind. September 25, 2023. A quiet day in New York City. David McCallum passed away at the age of 90. Peacefully, surrounded by family. No scandals, no chaos, just peace. And here's the kind of poetic twist that only life itself could write. His passing happened on the same day CBS aired a 20th anniversary marathon of NCIS. Millions of fans were watching Ducky on screen. While in real life, the man who brought him to life took his final bow. Almost like the universe had chosen that moment. One last curtain call for a man who had given everything to his craft. When news broke, tributes flooded in from actors, fans, even old co-stars who hadn't spoken to him in years. Robert Vaughn once called him a man who never aged, he just deepened. Mark Harmon said, he was the calm in the chaos. But maybe the most touching tribute came from his family. His son said, he was the kindest, coolest, and most patient father. He never raised his voice. Even when he had every reason to. That line hit people harder than any headline ever could. Because that's who he truly was. The man who lost everything once, but never lost his heart. He taught the world that sometimes revenge is overrated, that dignity can be louder than anger, and that the most powerful thing you can ever do is forgive. Decades after the scandal with Charles Bronson and Jill Ireland, people realized something profound. David McCallum won. Not in the Hollywood sense, but in the human sense. He outlasted the heartbreak. He outgrew the betrayal. He lived long enough to see himself celebrated again. Not for drama, but for grace. And if you really think about it, that's the greatest kind of victory there is. Because when you can look at the people who hurt you and still wish them peace, when you can turn pain into art and heartbreak into history, you've done something few ever manage. You've become unforgettable. So maybe the friendship between David McCallum and Charles Bronson did cost him everything. But what he built afterward, integrity, legacy, peace, was worth more than anything he lost. In the end, David McCallum didn't just survive Hollywood, he mastered it. Not by fighting back, but by walking away with grace. And that's what makes him legendary.